Fulgencio Batista remains one of the most controversial figures in Cuban history, emblematic of the country's mid-20th century turbulence. Rising from modest beginnings, Batista's trajectory from a sergeant in the army to the presidency underscores the volatile nature of Cuban politics during the first half of the 20th century. His career was marked by two distinct periods of political dominance, an early democratic phase in the 1940s and a later authoritarian rule following his 1952 military coup, culminating in his eventual overthrow by Fidel Castro in 1959. Batista's life and rule encapsulate the intersection of personal ambition, political opportunism, and the complex socio-economic forces shaping Cuba. Batista was born on January 16, 1901, in Baines, Oriente Province, to a working-class family. His early exposure to social and economic inequalities likely shaped his political consciousness. Joining the Cuban army as a young man, he quickly ascended the ranks, demonstrating a combination of charisma, tactical skill, and opportunism. Batista first came to national prominence in the 1930s during the tumultuous post-Machado era. After the fall of the dictator Gerardo Machado, Batista emerged as a powerful political broker, leveraging his influence within the military to become the de facto ruler of Cuba by the mid-1930s, even without formally holding the presidency. Batista's early rule was characterized by a pragmatic blend of populism and authoritarianism. He aligned with labor unions and organized crime interests, skillfully manipulating electoral politics while maintaining a veneer of legitimacy. In 1940, Batista was elected president in a relatively free and competitive election. His first presidency, 1940 to 1944, showcased his ability to enact modernizing reforms, including a new progressive constitution that expanded civil liberties, strengthened labor rights, and sought to modernize Cuba's economy. Batista's government invested in infrastructure, education, and public health, reflecting a period of relative stability and development. However, even during this period, his administration was not free from corruption, patronage, and the influence of U.S. business interests, particularly in sectors like sugar production and tourism. After stepping down in 1944, Batista spent several years in the United States, maintaining ties with political and business elites while observing Cuban politics from abroad. During his exile, he built the networks and resources that would later facilitate his dramatic return to power. By the early 1950s, Batista sensed the rising instability in Cuba and the growing dissatisfaction with the existing democratic system. Exploiting public disillusionment and political fragmentation, he staged a military coup on March 10, 1952, just months before scheduled elections. The coup, swift and largely bloodless, dissolved the legislature, annulled the upcoming elections, and positioned Batista as the head of a new authoritarian regime. Batista's second period in power, 1952 to 1959, was marked by stark contrasts to his earlier presidency. While he maintained a degree of modernization, particularly in urban development and infrastructure, his rule increasingly relied on repression, censorship, and the consolidation of military and police power. Political opposition was brutally suppressed. Opposition parties were banned or rendered powerless, and dissenters faced imprisonment, torture, or execution. Batista's administration became synonymous with corruption and cronyism, often favoring wealthy elites and U.S. business interests. Casinos, hotels, and tourism boomed, particularly in Havana, which earned a reputation as a playground for organized crime and foreign capital. While this economic boom brought wealth to some sectors, it deepened social inequalities and alienated the broader population. The 1950s also witnessed the rise of revolutionary movements in Cuba, driven by the growing discontent of peasants, workers, students, and intellectuals. Among these movements, Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement became the most prominent and ultimately decisive challenge to Batista's regime. Castro, alongside figures like Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos, waged a guerrilla war from the Sierra Maestra Mountains, advocating for social justice, national sovereignty, and the end of Batista's dictatorship. The movement gained increasing popular support, amplified by Batista's violent repression and failure to address systemic socio-economic problems. Batista's dependence on the military and police forces, coupled with his authoritarianism, alienated many former allies and eroded the cohesion of his regime. Internationally, Batista's Cuba faced mixed perceptions. While the United States initially maintained a pragmatic relationship with his regime due to Cold War considerations and economic interests, criticism grew over human rights abuses and political repression. Batista's reliance on U.S. support underscored the dependency of his government on external powers, while also highlighting the tensions between sovereignty and foreign influence in Cuban politics. By the late 1950s, both internal resistance and international pressure converged, creating conditions ripe for revolutionary change. The final months of Batista's rule were marked by increasing instability and fear. His government was unable to suppress the growing insurgency, while public dissatisfaction intensified due to economic inequality, government corruption, and violent crackdowns on dissent. Batista, realizing the inevitability of defeat, fled Cuba on January 1, 1959, marking the end of his dictatorship. The departure of Batista paved the way for Fidel Castro's revolutionary government, which would radically transform Cuban society, politics, and international alignments for decades to come. Batista lived the remainder of his life in exile, primarily in Spain and Portugal, passing away in 1973. Fulgencio Batista's legacy remains deeply contested. On one hand, his early presidency demonstrated capacity for modernizing reforms, constitutional innovation, and efforts at state building. On the other hand, his second regime epitomized authoritarianism, corruption, social inequality, and dependence on foreign interests. Batista's rule illustrates the complexities of mid-20th century Latin American politics, where populism, military influence, and foreign intervention intersected to shape governance and social outcomes. His life story offers a cautionary tale about the dangers of concentrated power, the fragility of democratic institutions, and the long-term consequences of political repression. Batista's impact on Cuban history extends beyond his own tenure. His overthrow by Castro catalyzed the Cuban Revolution, a transformative event that reshaped Latin American politics and Cold War dynamics. Batista's reliance on authoritarianism and neglect of social grievances provided the conditions for revolutionary mobilization, emphasizing the interplay between governance, legitimacy, and popular support. Moreover, his administration's entanglement with U.S. interests highlights the broader geopolitical context in which Latin American dictatorships operated, reflecting patterns of foreign influence and intervention that have had lasting regional repercussions. In conclusion, Fulgencio Batista represents a paradoxical figure, a man who rose from humble origins to wield extraordinary political power, yet whose ambition and authoritarian tendencies ultimately precipitated his downfall. His early promise at democratic reform was eclipsed by repression and corruption, while his second regime's failure underscores the limits of military power in the absence of popular legitimacy. Batista's story is inseparable from the Cuban Revolution, illustrating how systemic inequality, political exclusion, and authoritarian governance can fuel revolutionary change. For historians and political analysts, Batista's life and rule provide a compelling study of the dynamics of dictatorship, the vulnerabilities of democratic institutions, and the transformative potential of revolutionary movements in Latin America.